Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. September 1944. The Allies believed they could end the war with one bold strike. A daring plan codenamed Marketgarden was set into motion. Thousands of paratroopers would drop deep into Nazi-occupied Holland, seize the bridges, and open a highway into Germany's industrial heartland. If it worked, the war might be over by Christmas. But what began as the largest airborne assault in history soon spiraled into one of the costliest gambles of the Second World War. The skies above northern Europe filled with an armada unlike anything the world had seen before. Nearly 1,500 aircraft and more than 400 gliders soared over the Netherlands, carrying tens of thousands of paratroopers into Nazi-occupied territory. It was September 17, 1944, a Sunday that would be remembered not for liberation but for a gamble that nearly broke the Allied advance. The plan was daring. Drop paratroopers far behind enemy lines, secure the bridges that spanned the Dutch rivers and canals, and then unleash armored divisions racing up a single highway to punch deep into Germany. If it worked, the Allies could bypass the Siegfried Line, capture the Ruhr industrial heartland, and perhaps end the war by Christmas. To the soldiers looking out of those plane doors, it must have felt like destiny. The war in Europe was grinding toward its end, yet the cost in blood was rising with every mile. Here at last was a chance for something bold, decisive, and spectacular. A single strike that could topple the Third Reich in one swift blow. But the scale of the operation masked its fragility. The bridges had to be taken intact. The armored thrust had to keep moving without pause. And the men descending from the skies would have to hold out alone, surrounded under fire, with little more than what they could carry. It was the beginning of Operation Marketgarden, the largest airborne assault in history. A bold dream, a desperate gamble, and ultimately a bridge too far. At the heart of this gamble stood two men with very different visions of how to end the war. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander famed for victory in North Africa, believed in the power of a single concentrated strike. He called it the narrow front, a spear thrust that would shatter German defenses in one decisive push. Opposing him was Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower preferred the broad front approach, a steady grinding advance across the entire line, stretching German forces thin while avoiding reckless risks. To Eisenhower, slow and steady would wear down the Reich. To Montgomery, it was too cautious, too wasteful of time and lives. In the late summer of 1944, Montgomery saw his chance. The Allies had liberated Brussels, but their momentum was stalling. Supply lines were stretched, fuel was scarce, and German defenses were stiffening. Montgomery proposed Marketgarden as the bold alternative: throw everything into one daring strike through the Netherlands, bypass the Siegfried Line, and surge into Germany before winter could set in. Eisenhower hesitated. He and Montgomery had clashed before. Monty's confidence often came across as arrogance. But with pressure mounting to end the war quickly, Eisenhower agreed to a scaled-down version of the plan. Marketgarden was approved, a compromise between Montgomery's gamble and Eisenhower's caution. And so the stage was set: tens of thousands of airborne troops, an armored corps poised to drive through Holland, and the hope that a bold thrust could succeed where steady grinding had stalled. Yet from the very beginning, cracks were already showing in this uneasy marriage of strategies. Marketgarden was not one plan, but two woven tightly together. Market would see more than 30,000 paratroopers from the British 1st Airborne, the American 82nd and 101st, and the Polish brigade dropped across the Netherlands. Their mission sees key bridges over the Meuse, the Wall, and the lower Rhine lifelines that could carry Allied armor across rivers and canals. Then came Garden. This was the armored thrust British XXX Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks would charge up a single narrow highway from Belgium into the Netherlands. If the paratroopers held the bridges long enough, tanks and heavy guns would surge across, creating a corridor that pierced into Germany's industrial Ruhr. On paper, the plan was breathtaking. A bold strike cutting through the heart of enemy defenses, bypassing the heavily fortified Siegfried Line entirely. In fact, it was a mirror image of what the Germans themselves had done to France in 1940, slipping through the Low Countries to break a stalemate. If the enemy's gambit had worked once, why not now, but in reverse? Yet the landscape of the Netherlands made the blueprint fragile. Rivers and canals sliced through nearly every mile. Nearly 70% of the terrain was waterlogged, meaning bridges were not just useful, they were essential. Lose a single one, and the entire plan unraveled. Market and garden depended entirely on one another. If airborne troops faltered, the armor would stall. If the armor was delayed, the airborne would be crushed. The Allies had designed a daring symphony of timing and precision. But in war, even the smallest discordant note can bring down the whole performance. For all its daring, market garden carried flaws that were visible even before the first parachute opened. The airborne divisions were elite, but they were light infantry paratroopers could only carry what they dropped with. Heavy tanks, artillery, and supplies would come later, if at all. Their strength lay in shock and speed, yet the operation demanded they hold ground for days against armored counterattacks. The British XXX Corps, meanwhile, faced its own nightmare. Their path into the Netherlands was not an open plain, but a single elevated road, nicknamed later Hell's Highway. The soft Dutch soil made off-road movement impossible for tanks. One destroyed bridge, one ambush, and the armored thrust could be choked in a deadly traffic jam exposed on all sides. Intelligence, too, had been ignored. Dutch resistance fighters had warned of German panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. Though battered, they were still deadly enough to resist airborne troops, armed with little more than rifles, mortars, and light anti-tank guns. Allied planners dismissed the warnings as exaggerated, convinced German forces in the West were broken. Perhaps most dangerously, the timetable itself was wildly optimistic. Commanders assumed the airborne could seize bridges and hold them for 48 hours, just enough time for Horrocks tanks to arrive. But every mile, every delay, every bridge not captured on schedule would stretch that clock thinner and thinner. The soldiers preparing to jump believed they were about to write the final chapter of the war. What they didn't know was that their story was built on fragile hope, thin roads, and intelligence that commanders had chosen not to see. The morning of September 17th would put every flaw to the test. Dawn broke on September 17th, 1944, with the thunder of engines echoing across English airfields. Nearly 1,500 aircraft, Dakota Transport Sterlings and C-47s roared into the sky, towing more than 400 gliders, heavy with jeeps, guns, and supplies. It was a spectacle of steel and noise, a column stretching for miles carrying the largest airborne assault in history. Inside the planes, paratroopers sat in tense silence. British Red Berets, American Screaming Eagles, Polish volunteers all packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces painted, their gear clattering with every jolt of turbulence. Some scribbled last letters home, others whispered prayers. To many, this mission felt like destiny, the chance to strike the blow that could end the war. On the ground below, Dutch civilians looked up in awe as the sky filled with aircraft. To them, the endless waves of parachutes blooming overhead seemed like liberation descending from heaven itself. Children waved, farmers wept, and church bells rang as the Allies dropped into occupied soil. The first waves landed with remarkable precision. Paratroopers touched down near their designated zones, gliders slammed into fields with brutal force, and scattered units quickly regrouped. For a moment it seemed the plan was unfolding perfectly. Bridges would be taken, armor would arrive, and Christmas victory might not be just a dream. But success carried its own shadow. The very accuracy of the drops gave German commanders a clear picture of Allied objectives. Instead of confusion, the enemy now knew exactly where to strike back. Market Garden had begun not in secrecy, but with a beacon pointing to its own heart. At the northern tip of the plan lay Arnhem, the most crucial bridge of them all. If it fell, the road to Germany's Ruhr would be wide open. If it held, the entire operation would collapse. The task of seizing it fell to the British 1st Airborne Division under Major General Roy Urquhart. But from the beginning, fate conspired against them. Anti-aircraft batteries forced the paratroopers to land miles away from their objectives, scattering them across fields and woods west of the city. The delay gave German defenders precious time to regroup, even as Urquhart's men pressed forward. To make matters worse, the radios meant to coordinate the assault failed almost entirely. Static and silence replaced orders and updates. Battalions fought blind, cut off from one another, their general wandering through back streets, at one point hiding in a Dutch civilian's attic just to avoid capture. Only a single unit, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion, managed to fight its way to the Arnhem Bridge. Their barely 750 men entrenched themselves in a cluster of buildings on the northern end, turning houses into fortresses. From windows and doorways, they fired down onto the road, holding back columns of German armor. But help would not come. Reinforcements were pinned down in the city by Kampfgruppe Spindler, an improvised but deadly German battle group formed from SS Panzer remnants. Frost's men clung to the bridge alone, outnumbered and outgunned, their only hope that XXX Corps would arrive in time. Arnhem was supposed to be the key to ending the war. Instead, it was already becoming a siege, a desperate stand on the edge of collapse. South of Arnhem, the 82nd Airborne Division drifted down toward the fields near Nijmegen. At their head was Brigadier General James Gavin Jumpin' Jim, to his men who at just 37 years old had already become a legend among paratroopers. His orders were clear: secure the bridges at Nijmegen and hold the high ground that overlooked the corridor of advance. The first day brought swift success. Gavin's men seized the bridge over the Maas River and took the Groesbeek Heights, a ridge that would serve as a vital landing zone for supplies and reinforcements. From there, they dug in, scanning the forests of Reichswald, where they expected a German counterattack at any moment. But the real prize lay to the north, the Great Waal Bridge at Nijmegen. If captured, it would open the road to Arnhem. Gavin dispatched a detachment to seize it, but they met a wall of resistance. The 10th SS Panzer Division, bloodied but not broken, rushed into the city to block the Americans. Outnumbered and under fire, the paratroopers were pushed back before they could reach their target. By nightfall, Nijmegen was locked in stalemate. The Americans held ground to the south, but the bridge, the artery to Arnhem, remained in German hands. Every hour lost tightened the noose around John Frost's battalion at Arnhem. The wall would have to be crossed, but not yet. For now, the 82nd dug in, waiting for the armor of XXX Corps to reach them. Arnhem's fate depended on whether the Americans could hold long enough to break the German grip on Nijmegen. Further south, the Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne Division descended into the fields around Eindhoven. Their task was to capture a chain of bridges linking the highway from Belgium into the Netherlands, clearing the path for British armor to surge forward. At first, their landings were smooth, and their early objectives fell quickly. 3 bridges were taken intact, and the sight of American paratroopers marching through Dutch villages sparked jubilation. Civilians rushed into the streets with flowers and flags, embracing the men they believed had brought liberation. But fortune soon turned. The paratroopers failed to capture 2 critical crossings at Sun and Best. As engineers moved forward, German defenders blew the bridges sky high, leaving gaping wounds in the highway that XXX Corps would have to rebuild under fire. What should have been swift progress slowed to a crawl. Then came a devastating blow. A glider carrying documents crashed, and inside were plans for the entire operation. German commanders suddenly knew what Montgomery's great gamble was aiming for and where to strike hardest. By nightfall, the 101st were dug in along the corridor, holding what ground they could. Their successes had opened the door for the tanks, but the missing bridges and the captured plans cast a long shadow. What began with celebration was already turning into a desperate race against time. The second day of marketgarden dawned, not with reinforcements, but with silence. In England, thick fog and low clouds grounded transport planes. The follow-up airborne waves that were supposed to strengthen the bridgeheads never left the runways. Supplies sat waiting in hangars, while paratroopers in the Netherlands dug in with whatever ammunition they had carried on their backs. For the men already on the ground, every hour without reinforcement was a wound. Frost's battalion at Arnhem remained cut off, battered by German armor, their radios useless, their positions shrinking house by house. To the south, the 82nd and 101st Airborne faced mounting counterattacks, forced to defend their fragile gains without the promised flow of men and material from the sky. The Germans, however, were moving with grim efficiency. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of the Reich's most skilled defensive commanders, had his headquarters at Arnhem itself. With marketgarden unfolding practically on his doorstep, he wasted no time in throwing together an improvised defense. Wehrmacht infantry, SS units, and even training battalions were hurled into the fight, stiffened by those veteran panzer divisions the Allies had dismissed as unfit for combat. Instead of collapsing, the German defense was growing stronger by the hour. Each delay in the Allied timetable gave them time to regroup, reinforce, and strangle the paratroopers clinging to their isolated objectives. The dream of ending the war by Christmas was already slipping away, hidden behind the fog that had grounded the wings of salvation. At Arnhem Bridge, John Frost and his 2nd Battalion were alone in the storm. From the windows of 18 houses on the northern bank, his paratroopers rained fire on advancing German columns. Light anti-tank guns blasted at armored vehicles from point-blank range, while riflemen darted between shattered walls, turning each room into a fortress. But their strength was bleeding away. Ammunition ran low, radios remained silent, and food was nearly gone. German tanks crossed the bridge, unhindered shells slamming into buildings where Frost's men clung to their positions. Roofs collapsed, fires spread, and the defenders were pushed tighter into a shrinking pocket of rubble. Still, the paratroopers fought with a ferocity that astonished even their enemies. One German soldier later recalled that each house had to be taken room by room, grenade by grenade. Frost's men refused to yield, forcing the SS to commit wave after wave against a few hundred exhausted defenders. As the hours turned into days, the battle for Arnhem Bridge became less about victory and more about honor. Frost himself was wounded, but he stayed with his men until the last. By the time German forces finally overran the position, the battalion had been reduced to fragments. Out of nearly 750, only a handful would escape. The bridge still stood, but the men who had held it were gone. Arnhem, the linchpin of marketgarden, was slipping from Allied grasp, and with it, the fate of the entire operation began to unravel. While Frost's men clung desperately to Arnhem, the battle for Nijmegen erupted into chaos. The 82nd Airborne, joined at last by elements of XXX Corps, faced the brutal reality that the wall bridge, the vital crossing into the city, was still firmly in German hands. Without it, Arnhem could not be relieved. The solution was as desperate as it was deadly: a daylight river assault across the wall. In flimsy canvas boats, American paratroopers paddled straight into machine gun fire shells, tearing the water around them. Men were cut down midstream, their bodies carried away by the current. Yet wave after wave pressed on, scrambling ashore under fire, charging German defenses with bayonets and grenades. The river crossing cost lives by the hundreds, but it broke the stalemate. With the assault from the rear and XXX Corps pressing from the south, the Germans could no longer hold. By nightfall, the Allies seized the wall bridge, a rare triumph in an operation already sagging under failure. Yet victory came too late. Hours had been lost in hesitation then, in bloody fighting. Frost's battalion at Arnhem, waiting for the armor that was supposed to arrive on the second day, was now shattered. The capture of Nijmegen was a triumph of courage, but also a grim reminder that time was bleeding away faster than the Allies could advance. With Nijmegen finally in Allied hands, the road to Arnhem seemed open. But XXX Corps now faced the nightmare every planner had feared. Their entire advance was funneled along a single elevated highway, Hell's Highway, a narrow strip of pavement cutting through flooded fields and soft Dutch soil. The Germans struck like wolves. From both sides of the road, artillery and anti-tank guns hammered the column. Ambushes erupted in villages. One knocked-out tank or burning truck could halt miles of vehicles behind it, creating deadly traffic jams under constant fire. Engineers scrambled to repair blown bridges while infantry fought to keep the narrow corridor open. For the paratroopers, the delays were agony. Every hour the tanks were stalled was another hour. Frost's men bled at Arnhem, another hour. The Airborne clung to shrinking ground without supplies. Marketgarden's elegant timetable, designed with precision on Allied maps, was collapsing in the mud and smoke of the Dutch countryside. Yet the men pressed on. Dutch civilians risked their lives to guide Allied convoys, pointing out hidden routes and sheltering wounded soldiers. But courage alone could not bend the iron reality: the armored thrust was too slow. The enemy too determined, the road too fragile to carry the weight of Montgomery's grand design. The corridor was open, but it was bleeding. Arnhem, just miles ahead, was slipping beyond reach. At Arnhem, the final tragedy unfolded. Frost's gallant stand at the bridge was over his men, either dead captured or scattered. The rest of the 1st Airborne, still west of the city, clung to a shrinking pocket around Oosterbeek. Cut off short of food and battered by artillery, they were reduced to a desperate fight for survival. Major General Urquhart, once missing in action, had rejoined his men, but there was little he could do. His division had been promised relief in 2 days. By now, it was 6, and XXX Corps was still miles away. Ammunition was running dry. Wounded men lay in cellars and gardens tended by Dutch civilians who risked execution for aiding them. Then from the skies came a glimmer of hope. The 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade finally dropped into the battle their commander Stanisław Sosabowski, leading them into hell itself. But the drop zones were already under German fire. Many were killed before they even touched the ground. Out of the brigade, barely half survived the landing. A few Polish troops managed to cross the Rhine in flimsy boats to reinforce the British, but they were too few too late. Arnhem was a cauldron now surrounded by German tanks, every street a trap, every house a coffin. The 1st Airborne had gone into battle with 10,000 men. By the time Arnhem was lost, only a fraction remained fighting, clinging to ruins that could not be held. By late September, it was clear Arnhem could not be saved. What remained of the 1st Airborne Division was exhausted, starving, and nearly surrounded. Their weapons were down to the last rounds, their wounded overflowing makeshift field hospitals. Reinforcement was no longer possible, only escape. Under cover of darkness and a relentless Allied artillery barrage, the order was given retreat across the Rhine. Small groups of paratroopers slipped into the river, clinging to rubber boats or makeshift rafts, paddling silently through the black water while German flares lit the night sky. Many swam, weighed down by soaked uniforms, desperate to reach the far bank. On the southern shore, Canadian engineers risked everything to ferry the broken remnants of the division back to Allied lines. Dutch civilians guided men through back gardens and ditches, whispering directions as German patrols searched nearby. By dawn, the crossing was over. Only 741 men out of nearly $10,000 had returned. The rest lay dead wounded or in German captivity. For the survivors, there was no triumph, only the bitter taste of loss. They had fought with courage beyond measure, but Arnhem had slipped away. Operation Marketgarden, conceived as the bold stroke to end the war, had ended in retreat across a river that was supposed to be the gateway into Germany. In the aftermath, the truth was undeniable. Marketgarden had failed. Arnhem was lost. The road to the Ruhr remained closed, and the war dragged on through another brutal winter. Historians would later argue over who bore the blame: Montgomery for his overconfidence, Browning for dismissing intelligence, or Eisenhower for approving a plan built on hope instead of certainty. Yet for the men who fought, their blame mattered less than memory. British paratroopers remembered Arnhem as the place where comrades vanished into captivity or graves. Americans remembered Nijmegen and the wall crossing, where courage meant rowing into certain death. The Dutch remembered the promises of liberation that turned into hunger and occupation through the harsh winter that followed. Montgomery, ever defiant, insisted Marketgarden was 90% successful. But to those who lived it, the missing 10% was the difference between salvation and ruin. Arnhem had been, in the words of Lieutenant General Browning himself, a bridge too far. And so the operation entered history not as a triumph, but as a haunting lesson that even bold dreams carried on wings of steel, and faith can shatter against the hard stone of reality. The Rhine remained uncrossed, and the war, far from ending by Christmas, would grind on until the spring of 1945.